Hi, everyone. Welcome to my channel. And today we have a very special guest, Mordechai. Mordechai, how are you? How have you been?
Thank God. Isolating, as usual. As like everybody else.
That's right. And you're in Canada, so how is COVID lockdown going over there?
It's not as bad as the States, or parts of the States, from what I hear. But we were on CNN that said Canada is beating the curve. But still, we still have to wear masks, and everybody wears masks here. There's no big fighting of masks. We're okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Canadians.
in America, we fight about everything.
Yeah,
we fight about everything.
We stay with the British because we didn't want to fight. So, let you guys fought in your own country. We stay with the British, and we continue to stay with whatever they tell us.
And Shalom Yisrael, right?
We're the bosses, yes.
So Mordechai, it's very funny because some people may be asking, what is a clearly Ashkenazi Jew from Canada? What do they have to do with Puerto Rico? And what was really fascinating, and why I wanted to speak to you, publicly this way, is that you and I are actually related. And it's not just me that's related to you, but turns out you have had a DNA match to many, not just from Puerto Rico, but from Mexico and all over these Spanish countries. And it's very fascinating because we hear a lot about, Anusim saying, we have a connection to Israel, we were part of you at one point, and here these DNA tests are coming out, they're actually proving that. So I want to talk about approximately how many matches from the Caribbean and South America have you had, and were you surprised about that when these were coming back?
Well, the matches basically started with the autosomal testing, which is about 10 years old. They started doing commercial autosomal, that's your whole genome. That's when I started getting matches. And the first autosomal company was 23andMe. I started getting matches, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, I got Colombians, all over the place, right? And then I went on Family Tree DNA, another company, when it started doing autosomal, about a year after that, about 9 years ago. Also continuing matches. And the biggest one is Ancestry, which is about 3-4 years that it's really been, about 3 years. That's got the biggest database. I got like 200, I got personally about 200 and I think it's 202,000 matches. And of them, for sure, at least I have about 900 Sephardic Jews. I mean, Spanish, when I say Sephardic, I mean Conversos, people who have ancestry in these. Most of them don't know anything. Almost everyone I write don't know anything about their ancestry. They just know they're Colombian or Puerto Rican, and they can't go back too far. They can go back like grandparents, like most of us. They can't go back, but they know they've been in this area. But their autosomal mix, picks up that there's some sort of Jewish, some sort of small, minute, what matches. See, they can't tell what a Jew is. What we call Jew is not a racial thing per se. It's a population. Right. But because populations are so, a lot of them Jewish Ashkenazi Jews are very homogeneous. They're come from a small population. They come from Central Eastern Europe, all inbred. They're all like eighth cousin. I mean, they've done studies on this. Very, very close. So what happens is every Ashkenazi Jew is virtually related to every other Ashkenazi Jew. That's a fact.
Right.
When I start getting matches outside that pool, that almost for sure there has to be some Jewish ancestry, because I know I've been Ashkenazi Jew for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Which is why this was I wanted you on, because this is what's so fascinating. The fact that when you and I got connected, it was a good while ago. It was a few years ago.
Yeah.
But since then, it's been so many matches that I always tease you that you need to stop telling people you're Ashkenazi and just come out as a Sephardic, because there's been so many matches. And we're talking about, like you said, the fact that you have always known you were Jewish, your family has always been Jewish, and lo and behold, to have 800-900 matches of Sephardic Jews from the Caribbean really is a telltale sign of, there is still a connection here.
Well, the DNA, what the DNA shows, basically, this is only 10 years old. At least commercial, the autosomal testing, it's not that old. It's only about 10 years old. What it shows is that there's segments, because everybody is related to everybody if you go back far enough, right? But what it shows is when you start doing larger segments, and they know these are relatives to a certain, they don't know the range. And Ashkenazi Jews, they have a big problem because they're so inbred. The range could be like fourth or fifth cousin, or it could be 10th cousin, because they can't really tell.
Right.
It's like a mirror on a car. You know, objects could be closer than they appear. So because so what happened with the Conversos, or Jews who originally were Jews who left Spain, Portugal, and end up in the Caribbean and in the Spanish world, and even Brazil, they for many generations only married among each other. Even if they were practicing, they were either discriminated, they only would marry among their own small group for various reasons, inquisitions and economic and social things. They would marry for many, many generations. I would say at least till the late 1700s for sure.
My family, my grandmother was married still in that tradition. It's, you know, I've said that my grandmother and grandfather, right. So, I mean, you're talking, so even, and then within our family, that tradition is still alive and well. So I mean, you know.
So it depends on, you know, which culture certain groups would keep it longer. Other groups would already start assimilating by the early 1800s, by the mid 1800s. But because of that, because for many generations, from let's say the 1600s, late 1500s, when they came via Portugal and Spain, the majority came in the late 1500s because of the merging. You have to know the history. Whenever you do this, you have to know the history, the economic history, the actual political history, and demographics. You have to know all that stuff to understand the genealogy, to understand the DNA. What happened is because Spain and Portugal merged in 1580, most of the Jews, most of the practicing Jews in the Iberian Peninsula were in Portugal. The ones in Spain, for the greater part, 90% had already assimilated or left. The ones who had gone to Portugal in 1492, which is about at least 50 to 60% of the Jews who left Spain in 1492 went across the border to Portugal because it was right there. It was the closest place to go.
Right.
Those ones were much more traditional. They weren't inclined to assimilate. Then they were forced to sort of convert. They were forced to, and they weren't allowed to leave. The king wouldn't allow them to leave, unlike Spain.
Right.
Had to convert. But for 2 or 3 generations, he said, we're not going to, officially you're Christians, but we're going to close our eyes for private things. We're not going to, we're going to close our eyes. We're it's like the Italians in World War II. We're not that. The Spaniards were like Germans. They were very strict, but the Portuguese were not so strict, at least for a few generations. And then Spain took over Portugal. That was it. There's no fooling around. That was about 1580. So the Spanish Jews, or formerly Spanish Jews and now Portuguese Jews, started realizing, hey, it's very dangerous to stay here. We can't really fool around. We have to get out somewhere. So a lot of them went to the New World, to the Spanish-speaking world, because it was much easier to practice in certain parts of that world. The Inquisition was not as heavy. I mean, eventually Inquisition followed them. If you notice the history, Inquisition were set up in Mexico City in the 1550s. It was set up in Cartagena in Colombia. It was set up in Lima in 1530, because they knew Jews were coming there. That's why they set up Inquisition posts there. So when they were there in the New World, what they did when the Inquisition came, they weren't as efficient as the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. They were a little, less efficient. But what they did, the Conversos, we'll call them Conversos for crypto Jews, whatever. They have different variations. They generally left from the area that was the general settlement of where the Inquisition was, like Lima, Cartagena on the coast of Colombia, or Mexico City, and they usually went to the areas that were newly being settled. The Spanish Empire didn't start right away. It expanded like America. It started like in Mexico with Cortez. It started in Pizarro in South America, and then in the Caribbean. So what happened was that whenever the Inquisition was set up, and Cartagena generally handled the Caribbean, Cartagena in the Colombian coast, but the Caribbean, for some reason, it didn't come down on hard. Like in Cuba, they didn't come down. Puerto Rico didn't come down as hard. It was easier. That's why there was a greater escape to Cuba and Puerto Rico. They weren't.
Puerto Rico.
There was no office there. It was a little harder to get there. You got to get there by boat. So they escaped. They went to these areas. They went to northern Mexico. They went to Chile, which was the southern part. They went south from Lima. They went into like sort of Rio de Plata, which is around the area around which is now Argentina. These areas became settlements in the 1600s of crypto Jews, and they would practice for many years. And in Portugal, in Brazil, also there was a whole different parameter, a whole different dynamic in Brazil. But let's just talk about, let's say, Puerto Rico for the sake of your interest, Puerto Rico. All this.
So, it's crazy because we hear a lot about these other, like you said, Mexico, Brazil, and even Cuba to some extent, but Puerto Rico in itself hasn't really been told.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And so we're just starting now to hear the stories of what was going on from a lot of the descendants who are coming back and saying, listen, my grandparents were saying X, Y, and Z, and they were doing X, Y, and Z. And of course, you actually remember when they were kind of a little bit tight-lipped, and then I went over there, and of course there was this whole revelation.
General policy everywhere. If you read books, people, I don't know if you read this woman. She was from Costa Rica. Her name is Doreen Carvajal. I don't know if you read her book. It's called
I'm not sure if
it's called The Forgetting River, I think. The Forgetting River? Doreen Carvajal. She's a reporter for the New York Times, International New York Times. She also goes through how she tried finding from an aunt what was going on. An aunt's supposed to know. She found this thing. Nobody wanted to talk. It was very secretive because it was so ingrained, because it had been so dangerous for hundreds and hundreds, for many generations. It became so ingrained in the psyche that they didn't want to talk. But there was always a chain, not always, but a great deal of the time, there were certain families that would pass down certain traditions, and it was usually through the female line. That's what I found.
Right.
I found just whether it's always the case, but a great deal was always passed through the feminine line, whether because it had to do with they kept kashrut, they did the cooking. There were certain things that certain cultural things that women did more of, and plus, for some reason, they were much more careful about passing it down to somebody. And it usually passed down through the feminine line to a great extent. And if anybody knew that they would question, like a great-grandmother or some person like that, they would have the general tradition. They would have no better than the males for some reason. That's what I found culturally in that part of the world. But there's no question that they married among each other for many generations, the endogamy. And because they did that, the DNA, I'm talking about from a scientific, was preserved, because usually DNA, after 6, 7, 8 generations, it sort of recombines out. That's a health thing. You marry other sides, but if you marry cousins, it has a positive and negative aspect to it. Like we know there's genetic diseases, etc. But it also has certain cultural aspects and positive aspects. And the DNA, it shows up in DNA. Well, be less variant. You'll be much more closely, the segments will recombine from different cousins and will remain much longer. That's why Ashkenazi Jews, which had separated for at least 350 years from Sephardim, or to at least 350 years, which is about 10 generations, 10 to 12 generations, they will still find matches because of the inbreeding on both sides. The Ashkenazim are constant marrying cousins, and the Conversos are, people of Converso tradition are also marrying cousins. So you have two recombining genes. That's why they'll connect after 300 years, after 10, 12 generations.
Well, and this is the case with you. You're literally the living embodiment of what you just said, because, it's almost on, like, at least a weekly basis, you're getting an email. And you know what's so crazy is that some of the people that you've said to me about, I got another match, I've also checked in my ancestry, and we were also related as well. So it's just really amazing, because it's exactly what you said. All of this inbreeding is kind of preserved us. But now what I think is so interesting is that we have we have the Mordechais of the world who will hopefully now start to see these matches come together.
I hope so, and the Devorahs. I mean, everybody has their own. Everybody when I've met, I've done this, like I said, at least 10 years where I've got all these autosomal matches, and everybody has a different story and a different approach and a different perspective. Some of them convert, people have converted to Judaism. Some of them just become, they take it, some become more Catholic. Everybody has their own way to deal with it. And it's an individual thing because everything affects everybody personally, because 99% of the cases, people will not have a tradition of knowing for sure my great-great-grandfather was Jewish until they start doing this research. It's very rare for them to have had a chain that's been passed on for that long, because it's hundreds of years. Look, when I deal with Ashkenazi Jews, very few Ashkenazi Jews can trace back more than 3-4 generations, unless they have some sort of rabbi or something like that. They have a rabbi on the line. The rabbi, they kept their yichus, they kept their genealogy. But a regular guy will not be able, because people were moving around, they were traveling, they're trying to make a living. Genealogy is a rich man's thing, right? You have to have money, you have to have time. If you're trying to survive, trying to make a living, trying to bring up a family, you don't have time for this. Even my parents, I didn't know my book, they were too busy surviving. So you have to find, when you start doing the digging, you have to be very lucky to either find some relative or somebody that was interested.
Which was the case with us. We had a famous relative, which obviously, at least from his time down, we were able to capture. But you make an interesting point, because a lot of people in Puerto Rico have this very problem where past 1750, they start to run into trouble because, as you know, and not only that, they were traveling, they had the trade routes, they were pirating, they were moving all over, they were shuffling.
Changed their names. I had cases, I had this woman, her name was Lopez, Rachel Lopez, she was Puerto Rican. This was one of my first matches like 10 years ago. So I saw she had a match, so I wrote her an email, and she responded, and she wrote me. It's interesting. I have the thing here, because I just talked to this professor. I'll tell you about him in a second, because he was supposed to write a book about the Conversos in Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Caribbean, but he got Parkinson's. This was about 8-9 years ago, and he hasn't been able to do research on this stuff. But he had some articles which he's got to send me. So this Rachel Lopez writes me an email, for example. This is like one of the first ones I got like 10 years ago. So she's a regular New York Puerto Rican. She got her family, she lists her family surname. So she was born in 1963. Arroyo, Valle, Rosa, Casio, Alorando, Torres, Baez, Ramos, Lugo, Pena. The Spanish names. Then she says, I'm of Puerto Rican descent, born in the USA. Both my parents are from Puerto Rico, Isabela and Ponce. I guess those are towns, right? Isabela and Ponce?
They are. Yeah,
okay, my grandmother says listen to this, her grandmother says we are Portuguese and Spanish descent with Tiano Indian. My grandmother's family lived in Guayanilla and Yaco, Puerto Rico. That's an area, I guess. I just started my journey and looking for new discoveries. And she says here, the original family name, this is what her grandmother told her. My grandmother always told a story about Portuguese grandfather. And when they say grandfather, I think it means somebody further back. It's not just a grandfather.
Right.
And fled Portugal because of political persecutions. Now, she says political persecution. Obviously, they won't let them vote. I mean, obviously, it's probably a religion thing, right? But they don't say that. They're not going to say that.
Right.
He arrived in Puerto Rico and assumed the name of Torres. And that's all I remember of his story. Torres, which is a Portuguese name. And
right.
Her name was Arroyo, right? So they changed her name. This is very common among Conversos, constantly changing names, because when the church went after them, they would be looking for certain names, and if you we know that.
Correct.
Every country does that. That's the first thing to do, is change your names. But he told this grandmother had this tradition that her grandfather, which is probably much further back, had to leave Portugal for political reasons. Right? I guess he was trying to rebel against
political reasons.
and changed his name to Torres. Took from Arroyo. So obviously he was wanted under this Arroyo, whatever name it was.
Right.
It's Jewish. They knew it was, and he took the name Torres, which is a very common Portuguese name. So I see the name Ocasio. For example, this woman was Ocasio. Now, the member of the House of Representatives. What's her name?
I do.
Right?
I do. The one that's not so friendly to Jews, I do.
It's interesting. You heard, what she said 2 years ago at a Hanukkah party?
I remember.
I think she said one of her uncles investigated, and she comes from Spanish Jews, from
Spanish, right, correct.
Which is obviously correct. I mean, she's not just using it for political points. I think
she's not. And to be quite frank, I also have a match, and I think she also may be potentially doing an episode of the show, and her last name is also Ocasio.
Yeah.
So I mean, for 100%, she is not. Whether we agree with her politics or not, there's no question that she comes from this lineage. There's no question about it.
It's not an anti. She likes Bernie Sanders, or whatever you want to say about that.
Right.
But no, there's no question that when I get matches. When people write books, there's Cuban matches. I've got Cubans, and it's interesting what the DNA thing does. It also does an ethnicity breakdown, which is subject to controversy. But they can tell if you're sub-Saharan African. They generally can tell general groups. If you're Native American, generally also because it's a certain type of and European. Now, European gets a little dicey because Europeans are the Southern European, they can tell, Northern European. They try doing Irish, but, it's not that exact. But when they do almost every one of the matches I have, the majority of them, have some sort of Native American. If they've been in America 400 years, they will have Native American ancestry. And some from the Dominican Republic. I had a guy who I matched in the Dominican Republic. What was his name? He was named after a baseball player, not Bautista. But anyway, he had sub-Saharan. He had like 10% or 15% sub-Saharan African. Certain areas have different ethnic mixed breakdowns. Cubans are much more white, or they're more European. Other ones, Mexicans have a lot more native. Dominican Republic have a lot more sub-Saharan African. Depends where you are in the islands. Colombian is, I think, a little bit native, and some sort of, they have this makeup, but they will all have Jewish. They all have what they call identified as European Jew. Now, European Jew, the DNA companies, means they know they use the Ashkenazic signpost, because the Ashkenazim are like 90% of the Jews who came to America, and that they tested in huge amounts, and they know what their autosomal base is because it's so inbred. So some of them, like 23andMe used to say to some guy, he was a Cuban guy, says you have 0.3% Ashkenazic Jew. Right. And you can't understand. I had no Polish or Jewish ancestry thing. These guys have been living, there for hundreds of years. But what it means, what we now realize what it means is it's the component of Ashkenazic Jews that's found among Ashkenazis that you share. That's really Sephardic, probably. Sephardic or that's what it is. They call it Ashkenazic Jew because it's found among Ashkenazic Jews. It's also found among Sephardim, but they don't have enough Sephardim in their database to really, isolate it as much.
And I anticipate that as the science, I was talking with somebody on another episode, and we were talking about that, even the science it's coming along, but what it'll look like in 5-10 years, it'll be even more, enhanced. And that's what I anticipate that, while we can't see an official, Sephardic Jew, I have a feeling that in time, that the science is going to catch up with that.
They have to test. The key is to testing guys who, because the only other way to know is test ancient skeletons, or test skeletons from, they're doing Columbus's DNA now. I remember I told you in 2021, Spain.
Yes.
Finally they finished the genotype for Columbus. But testing a skeleton, you get the skeleton's actual breakdown. But otherwise, you have to use living populations. And you have to extrapolate that if guys lived here for hundreds of years, and this is the population. Even though if you go back far, populations have moved all over the place. So you can't use it all the time, but it can be used to a certain amount of accuracy. But you have to need a big database, and you need a lot of people and a lot of information. to back up that these people they can trace back as far as they can.
Right.
They match other people, so that's probably the population. So they need Sephardim. They need a lot more Sephardim, which they're testing, and isolates. And Sephardim also are spread all over the place. North African Sephardim, you got Turkish Sephardim. They're all assimilated. Sephardim have been moving around everywhere. It's not like they've been in one place. Ashkenazim are much closer to each other because they've been sort of isolated and sort of living in one area and sort of moving among those small groups of people. Where Sephardim sort of moved around and traveled a lot more. They were business people. They were much more, what's the word, progressive than Ashkenazim. At least in those days. Well, they were the business people.
Right.
They had all the economics, the famous the people of the nation. You've heard that? The Portuguese traders, they were huge traders all through the world. And they had the Portuguese Jewish colonies in China, in Japan. So you'll get DNA markers that are Chinese actually in the population.
Right.
The Chinese, you only find them in South Asia, and Japanese, and they've come back in the Jewish population because they had traders who went out these, married or converted some girl there, brought her back or brought the kids back, assimilated back into the European culture in the 1600s. And so that autosomal or that mitochondrial will remain. That still will remain, and they can't understand it. It's South Asian. How's it coming in? And we're not talking thousands of years ago. We're talking the last 400 or 500 years. So it's traders, and the history backs it up. Portuguese traders were going. They were they were not acting as Jews. They were pretending they were conversos, going to India, Goa. That's why they set up a Inquisition thing in Goa. They were going to Macau, which was a Portuguese colony. They were going to Japan, which was also Portuguese and Dutch colonies. They were trading, and if you're there for 67 or 50, 60 years, you will marry or you bring back some nice Japanese woman, and you converted them because in those days it wasn't the Israeli rabbinate. It was a lot easier to sort of bring. If you practiced Judaism, you became part of the people. If you did our stuff, it wasn't a racial thing.
Right.
You became, after a couple of generations, you come back. She looks Chinese, but she knows how to speak Yiddish, or she knows how to cook, chong, or whatever it is. She's one of us. After many generations, they would sort of intermarry, and you wouldn't pick it up. But the DNA, there's certain, let's say the maternal DNA would still remain. Certain the markers would remain, and they know it's coming from Asia. So the same thing with the Conversos. They were picking up populations from all through America, and now that they're coming back. Right? It's a thing of religion. It's not a thing of race. It's not a racial thing because they're all mixed. And Jews, Ashkenazi Jews are all mixed too. You'll find them Ashkenazi European markers, North European markers. You'll find Slavic markers. You'll pick that up to a small extent, but they exist because the reason was, if you look at what was happening, Jews were generally, even Converso Jews, had slaves, or they had servants, especially women, and they had servants, and eventually those servants, they either had children with the servants, or the servants themselves were interested. They came from, they said, I like Judaism. I got used to it. My daughter was brought up in the house. She loves this stuff. She marries, they just blend in because they're brought up like that. They're brought up as like adopting a kid. So you'll find they come into the population from every culture, and they will retain, and you don't, and as far as you know, who knows that my great-great-grandmother was some slave, some Polish servant in northern Lithuania, right? You don't know that.
Right.
Very rarely they have these stories, but the DNA will pick up certain things like that. We'll pick up very small markers of Slavic DNA or North European DNA and Italian DNA, what they call Southern Italian that matches Italians. And, it's Jews have been around. They will have a component of the Middle East. They'll all have that component, and they'll have Europe. They'll have Mediterranean because that's where they were. And wherever they went, they would pick up people who joined them. Even in bad times, for various reasons, they would become part of the Jewish people. That's the way it is. And so when you start doing DNA, you're going to find all this stuff out.
Yeah, and it's funny because it poses a very interesting dilemma for these people who are trying to come back, and they're having this issue. You know, a lot of the Rabbanim want to see the paperwork, and for a lot of Conversos, this becomes problematic because of these reasons that you've laid out.
Even Russians coming to Israel have that problem, and they're only like 100 years that the communism came over, right? And they can't find paperwork, and they have big problems, right? So imagine 300-400 years in a culture, for sure. How are you going to get paperwork, especially if you got an Inquisition?
Exactly.
Like this.
And you have name changing, and you have all these things. So you almost have to ask yourself.
Is that Cuban woman, Judy?
Yes. Yep. I know who you're talking about.
That's her married name. I mean, it's an Ashkenazic name.
Right.
She's an Ashkenazic rabbi. I don't know what her maiden name is. I don't think she gives it, but she was a Cuban. She was a Cuban, had been Spanish, and she traced down. She was able to get a genealogist to go back to Spain. She knew the town where her parents, and her grandparents only came in the 1930s to Cuba from Spain, from a town in Spain.
Right.
They went back. She was trying to get her maternal line because, for halakhic reasons, it goes through the mother's line, as we know. Right. She was trying to find Shane. I mean, she eventually converted, just as a regular conversion. But as a curiosity, she had a feeling that she had maternal ancestors. She was always Jewish, and she spent many years and hired genealogists and was able, because of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition has two sides, keeps record on every Jew. So, if you're living there, it's bad news. But when you're doing genealogy, 100 years,
it's great.
It's great. Right? For the guys who are alive then, it's bad. You don't want to be in the records.
Right.
She found her maternal line, and she wrote her book, her 15 grandmothers. And that is extremely rare. That is not that common.
And I think that's the thing, too, that I think that some people think, I can do this, too. And it's not as easy, like you said. No. And again, so it poses a very interesting dilemma, because you really want to pick the brain of somebody who can make these decisions as to what to do with all of these, Conversos, and through no fault of their own. Like you said, my mom was just trying to live. Well, these people were really trying to survive. Yeah. So now to come back, and at the time, you're not worried about, we need to keep this record, we need to keep the record of this bris or our ketubah. Exactly. They're trying to just survive, and we'll think about it another day. Now, today is that day, and so now you have all these Anusim who are having tremendous difficulty trying to trace.
The rabbinate. Difficulty.
Right. So
see, that's
exactly. Well, at least as far as saying I'm a Jew, which is a lot harder, or I have this Jewish ancestry. Yeah. So it takes the right kind of learned rabbi to know what to do. But it is a very interesting dilemma, because, again, through no fault of these Anusim Conversos that were traveling around, they could not keep these records. And so a lot of people, they get very frustrated, and they tend to lose hope that they're not going to find what they're looking for.
Unfortunately,
so
it does. It's not the problem with the Conversos. It's a problem with the culture, the modern culture, and this might not have been a culture 100 years ago.
Right.
In certain ways, it was. For example, Ashkenazic Jews are very you become very an island among yourself. Even my parents, you speak Yiddish, you're an Ashkenazic Jew. And the famous story of the guy, I think he invented yogurt. It was the guy who did the yogurt. He was a Sephardic Jew. I forgot the name of the yogurt, or one of the yogurt companies. He died about 9 years ago. And his parents came from, I think it was Turkey. There was a big migration, 1910, 1912. But also, beside the East European migrations to the States, there was also a smaller Sephardic migration from Syria, which was the Ottoman Empire, Syria or Turkey or Greece, those areas of the Ottoman Empire. For various political reasons, there was a lot of unrest, etc., and the economic in the States, the opportunities like everybody else. So this guy came to Lower Side. He wanted to get a job. And the Lower Side was all Yiddish. Was all Yiddish. He said, I'm Jewish. He said, well, say something in Yiddish. He couldn't speak Yiddish. He says, you're not Jewish. Like, what are you talking about? You don't know Yiddish. You can't be Jewish. This is how insulated they were, because they came from shtetls. This is how they didn't read books on geography or history. They were very insulated, in a certain way, ignorant in their own way, brilliant in other ways, but ignorant in world events. And if you don't speak Yiddish, you're not Jewish. So what he did is he pulled down his pants. This is a New York Times op-ed. He pulled down his pants, and he showed he was circumcised. Because in those days, it was not that common to be circumcised. You know, like 1950s America. So they finally believed him. They gave him a job. But this is the attitude towards Sephardim. It's a cultural thing. So you have a rabbinate, you know, unfortunately. They're very cautious, they're very conservative, and they're very scared, I don't know why, of taking in people who aren't like sincere Jews. But if a guy wants to convert, you have to go the steps of conversion. You went through it, unfortunately. They discourage you. You know, they're supposed to discourage you. Now, the question is, there's a line between discouraging and complete. It's a very fine line, and it takes a very great intelligence and foresight to be able to sort of balance that line of not sort of encouraging too much and bringing out the negative stuff, but at the same time not discouraging too much and sort of turning the person completely off. So if a guy has a conversal ancestry and is drawn, or a woman or a man is drawn to this for some reason, there's a reason for it, and they should like sort of cultivate it, because it's not coming from some guy who's marrying a Jewish guy, or a girl meets a Jewish guy who's a doctor, wants to marry. That's what they're scared of, those type of conversions. She marries, he's a rich doctor, I want to convert, and then they get divorced, goodbye, something that's not sincere. They want sincere stuff. So that's why they should be a little bit more disconcerting, but they're all scared. They're all scared because that's the way it is now. Everybody's scared. But like I said, in the 1600s, when they would bring a Chinese woman back into Europe, she would just blend in. There was no rabbinate. There was a different culture. You became part of the Jews because you acted like a Jew. You practiced Judaism. And because it was tough being a Jew. So you're practicing Judaism to keep the custom.
And it's no easier today. It really is no easier today. It's not as if, I was speaking with another guest. Yeah, and I was speaking with another guest, and he was saying, the Ashkenazis, they were always treated badly. And a lot of times, people, like you said, it's the mentality, but they think of a Jew as what we see as Ashkenazi, and so there's no idea of what a Sephardic Jew looks like.
They were very insulated. The guys in the shtetls, they were very insulated. Like I said, didn't study history. The rabbis knew what Sephardic Jews were because they had a little bit more culture. They knew what. But the average guy did not see a Sephardic Jew speaking Spanish. They just didn't. They were just seeing. They saw Polacks or they saw Ukrainians who were trying to kill them. If you weren't Jewish, if you weren't one of us, you were against us. That's that's the culture. That's unfortunate. That's the culture. That's where they brought it, because hundreds of years of persecution and pogroms and stuff like that sort of turns you inward, and that happens to any culture. So if you weren't part of us, who are you? Spanish. But as people become more educated, they realize.
And that's a big problem that at least I'm encountering. When I'm doing a lecture or I'm doing anything like this. And people bring Puerto Rican Jews or any, like Cuban, Mexican, they come to these shiurs, and it's almost like they're hearing for the first time. Yeah, it makes sense to them, but they're still like in this disbelief. And I get it. I went through it.
You have to know your history, your world history.
Right.
Simple studying history, which unfortunately a lot of the yeshivas don't emphasize. It's the Mora. I went to yeshiva. It's very narrow stuff. In the Haredi world, we're not generally very narrow stuff, and they don't really have the cultural background to understand unless they educate themselves, and which they smart ones well do that, and realize, hey, it's a big world out there, and the history of the Jews is very diverse. The Rambam didn't speak Yiddish. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write Ashtrammel. These guys, they have to realize that David Melech was not, wearing a kittel. They had a different, they would have to picture themselves how history and culture went and how the world is. And if you're in your own world, it takes a mind to understand if you don't travel. If you don't travel, you don't study. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and finding the right rabbi is key. I mean, and I think for the reasons that you highlighted, if you don't find the right rabbi, you could really be spinning your wheels, trying to come back, even through a conversion.
Yeah, rabbis. Look, that's a heavy lecture by itself. You know, the rabbinical politics and Eretz Israel, the politics in Israel with the conversions. I mean, the Russians have there's a whole culture there with the Russians, because
Right.
Russians is the big thing there. That was the big population, like huge millions of Russians came over in the 1980s to Israel, and a lot of them didn't necessarily weren't full Jews or mixed Jews. And there's a famous movie actually about that called The Green Chariot. It's I don't know if you can get it. You might be able to get it. It's got subtitles. It's an Israeli movie. It was done about 15 years ago. It's about by an Orthodox in Israel. There was an Orthodox school of films. You know, there was Orthodox, specifically designed for Orthodox thinking. But they were very, very professional, very well done. Like Ushpizin. I don't know if you've ever seen Ushpizin. Yeah.
I did see it. That's like a yearly classic. Like who doesn't watch that during the time of Sukkot, right?
Even though the guy wasn't originally, he's a Baal Tshuva, so he knew the film world, but he's now become very religious, and he makes a film along those lines. And there are other people like that. And so this Green Chariot, America Ba Yeraka, it's called. It's a story about a Russian kid who's learning in yeshiva. And his father's a taxi driver, and his mother died, and his father comes and brings him something that his mother left him, a little thing, and it's inside a little toy box that looks like a green chariot. It's called and it's a cross. And he says, "Who's this?" He says, "It's my mother's." You know, she had a cross, and says, "No, your mother was Jewish. She always went there. This is your mother's mother, your grandmother." So he realizes, because he went to yeshiva, that his grandmother was Christian. Right. You know, so he's now got he's supposed to marry a girl, and he's got a problem because he's seeing the very Orthodox Israeli world, and he has to go through conversion. But he knows more than the rabbi. He's like a brilliant student, and he knows more than the rabbis who are supposed to convert him. He knows all the laws, because he went to yeshiva, and he knows all the things, and it's ironic. And, he finds it like he's very torn. It's an interesting movie about somebody who's realizes he always thought he was Jewish, and he finds out he's not, and he wants to go through the conversion. He realizes how crazy this is. I've always been Jewish. Why do I have to go through this?
Right.
But we're talking about Israeli rabbinate, and you have to go through certain steps. That's how they did it. But if you're lucky and you get a good rabbi, or get a rabbi who's got some clout, the problem is they're all scared. Even good rabbis are scared of losing their job or whatever, especially in Israel, where it's sort of it's part of the government payment thing. They're scared. I'm making sure. Now, I think there's been controversy, but they're allowing DNA tests. I know Lieberman opposed it, but they're only allowing it to the advantage of a convert, because a lot, like you said, they don't have records because of World War II, or they don't know. And this is only 100 years because communism suppressed it. But if they do a DNA test, because the rabbinate, it's all mother. It's all just the mother. If your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. We don't care anything. It's just halakhic, straight halakhic.
Right.
So there's a DNA test, a mitochondrial maternal DNA test, that they've been doing for the last 20 years, even before they did autosomal tests. And this DNA test, and they found there are certain markers among Ashkenazim. Sephardim also have markers, but Ashkenazim, because they're so inbred, and these Russians are coming from that Ashkenazic world, so they would be part of that, are almost, if you have 4 or 5 of these, any one of these markers, you're almost 99% Jewish. Your mother is Jewish.
That's
right?
very interesting.
So they're using it to say, Rabbi says, it's that you really are Jewish, right? But if you don't have it, doesn't mean you're not. It doesn't mean you're not. Right. But if you don't bring documents, you have to go through the regular conversion. But if you have this marker, then you're okay. You might be okay. So they're trying to get that passed. I think they passed it for certain things because it's controversial, but they're trying to make it easier. If it's used to make something easier, they might allow it. And not to the disadvantage of somebody, because if you don't have it, it doesn't mean you're not. But if you do,
right,
we'll accept you without having to go through that whole process, and makes it easier or something like that. But
it's very interesting, and it's very interesting to see how all of this is going to unfold, because the Anusim are not going away. They're not going away, and more are coming.
The Anusim are the Spanish matches I've had, almost all of them, not all of them, but the ones I've seen when they used to show the mitochondrial test, when they did mitochondrial and they used to show it, most of them had Native American mitochondrial. A great majority of them had A1, B1, C1d. They're basically Native American maternal lines, which is interesting. It wasn't a European maternal. A lot of them had maternal on the female line. They had, they had classic Native American lines. Now, why that is culturally, I mean, I have theories of why that is, because when the Anusim came, some of them took women because there was a lack of women and converted them and just said, they weren't, the worst thing to do was take a Christian because it was very dangerous. There weren't the place where there weren't that many Christian women, but they would know their religion and your practice of Judaism. They go right to they inform you. There were cases where they would inform to the Inquisition, and it was very dangerous. So they took native women. They would teach them the things, and they were compliant because they, and if they loved the guy, they would do their stuff. And they would marry him, and the kids, that's what happened. And they would practice Judaism. It just happened to be that was the ethnic line that happened to be that way because they were stuck there for 300-400 years in northern Mexico or Colombian jungles, wherever they were. That happened to be the case in the first years that they were there. So they can't use a mitochondrial as a test for that thing like they do with the Russians, which is more current. But it's like any conversion. If you want to be Jewish, it's not a question of your ethnicity. It's a question of what you want, what your sincerity is. I mean, and the rabbinate should know that. And the fact that you have some sort of ancestry probably gives you an impetus, and that's not that shouldn't be a negative impetus. Like I want to marry some rich Jewish doctor, which they're all scared of, or something like that. That they consider that's marrying for a specific ulterior motives. Here you're marrying because you're inspired by your ancestry. So that is actually that shouldn't be a negative thing. That should work as a positive and should encourage you. And if the person wants to study and is interested, I don't know why they discourage it. To me, I
hope that in the future that even these kinds of stories and interviews and things like that the Rabbanim will start to, first of all, it's like I said, the Anusim are not going away. And it poses...
As more people do DNA tests.
Right. And so, I mean, at some point, they're going to, I think, have to come back to the table and re-examine, like you said, what the criteria is for a return. And like you said, you can't be based on the paperwork because it just may not exist.
Of course.
Now, I went through a long process, but it was funny because when Hashem said it's time, it was like that, and suddenly I find myself...
You got lucky.
Right.
Good rabbi.
That's what I'm saying. I found myself in the office of a Rav who not only had the authority, but he had the knowledge.
That's
and so he knew right away what was going on, and he said, and it's funny because he did not generally want to be involved in conversions, but when he heard my story, he said, I cannot not be involved. And I ask him all the time, do you think I was a good investment? And he says, absolutely. So he feels very confident in his decision.
You're lucky. There's a certain amount of luck in everything, Mazel, in everything. So we just have to, have more rabbis your rabbi has to teach more rabbis. It's your rabbi has to spread the word. It's rabbis. They'll listen to other rabbis. Will be more listen to other rabbis rather than convert. Other rabbis have to spread the word and say this is the story. These people are sincere. They went through so much and they realized what their culture went through, what their people went through. They have people that are still practicing these customs. I had a guy in California. I think he was a Mexican guy. And he told me, I had a DNA match with him, but he had no history of Jewish thing. But he said, I have a tradition. We have a tradition in our family, just a strange tradition. When we eat fish, we will never eat shellfish or squid or octopus. We just eat regular fish. Is there anything to that? I said, do you have any allergies? No, nobody has any allergies or anything. So that's a Jewish thing because fish aren't kosher. There must have been some tradition that was passed on. And sometimes certain traditions are passed on, like, for example, taking challah. Like you're supposed to take the first dough. There was a guy who was a cook in Mexico. There's a book written by a guy called Richard Santos. He was a historian. Died about 4 or 5 years ago. He was a historian in Texas. Many generations. He was a Hispanic, and he wrote on the introduction of the book. He called Apology, Belated Apology. Fascinating. You should read that one page. I could scan it to you, where he apologizes to his grandfather. His name was Alameda. His grandfather, he was in school in Texas. I just tell this story. He was in school in Texas, and his school was mainly white kids. You know, it was a part that was mainly white, not that many Hispanics. And the teacher was talking about the history, and he saw this kid was Hispanic. So he says, oh, the Hispanic, the culture, the Aztecs, they were great culture, great civilization, you know. And then another time he's talking about the Alamo, and he's talking about the Mexicans were massacred, or, you know, the red flag, and they massacred every man at the Alamo. So he got curious. He was about 11 or 12. He says, what am I? Am I a Mexican? Am I Aztec? Am I Indian? You know, because he's been living in Texas for many years. So he asked his grandfather. Grandfather was a cook. He was like one of these traveling construction crews. They used to travel, road crews, and he was the cook for them. So he would ask his grandfather. His grandfather says, you know, we're Jews. We're Jews. So he also somos Judeos. So he asked his sister, is he getting senile? He thought, you know, what kind of thing? We go to church every day. How come we be Jews? You know, what kind of thing is this? He's saying we're Jews? You know, so he was a kid. He thought he was crazy or something like that. As he grew up and he started doing research, he became an archivist, and he saw the whole history that these guys were Jews. They had come. And then he said his grandfather, one of the things his grandfather used to do is when he was on would bake stuff for the crew, he would take the first dough and he would throw it in the fire, and he would call Benedicte de Dios, you know, or something like that, blessing of God. This was challah. You know, he didn't know what this was, but as he knew later on, as he grew up, and he realized that so he wrote an apology to his grandfather, his belated apology. He thought he was crazy. He's right. He was right all the time. So it's a beautiful apology.
You know, this is exactly what you know, I had hoped. You know, a lot of that these, you know, episodes would kind of bring out, because sometimes when I run into another Puerto Rican that I know is a Jew, just based on, you know, the last name and where they came from, and especially if they were from the mountains of Puerto Rico, and it's just like you said, they're like, we went to Catholic church all the time. What are you talking about? Yeah. And then as they learn, they're like, oh my gosh, I think you were right.
The culture and what's going on and the history, then they can sort of put it together. But when you're a kid, you don't know that. Or if you remain a kid psychologically, because you never really study it. So you remain in certain ways a child. But when you become an adult and you start studying, you realize things are not that simple, you know? And you have
you know, I got to tell you, this has been an amazing conversation. And I have to say, first of all, I hope this is not the last time that we do this, but, you know, I think that the Anusim really could use an advocate like you, because you're just so knowledgeable, and, I mean, you really get it, and it's just crazy. Like I said, the fact that you've been matched to so many of them, I mean, just proves all the things that you've been saying, and I really hope to have you back. Your knowledge is just something that the Anusim really could benefit from, that the Rabbanim, I think, could really, you know, benefit from. It's just, you know, I really hope to impose my cousin relationship with you and just glean all of the knowledge that you've really been accumulating for a lot of years. But we're going to end it now, and I truly, sincerely, you have an open invitation to do it again. But that's it for today, and I hope we'll all be together again soon. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you very much.